At my husband's company dinner, he introduced me as just someone who works in HR, while his colleagues bragged about their wives' achievements. When his boss asked what I did specifically, my husband laughed dismissively and said, "Nothing too important. She handles paperwork and employee complaints." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Real business decisions are made by people like us. I smiled, politely excused myself to the restroom, and quietly submitted my acceptance email for the Chief Executive Officer position at Morrison Industries, his company. Monday morning, I'd be announcing myself as his new boss's boss. The sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel still echoes in my mind as I think about that evening. It was supposed to be a celebration, Morrison Industries' annual executive dinner, where the company's top performers and their spouses gathered to toast another successful quarter. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks prior, printed on heavy cream cardstock with elegant gold lettering that screamed prestige and exclusivity. "You'll need to get something appropriate to wear," my husband David had said, barely looking up from his laptop as he tossed the invitation onto our kitchen counter. "This isn't one of your casual HR events. These are serious business people." I remember staring at that invitation, feeling the familiar knot of frustration form in my stomach. After 12 years of marriage, David still spoke to me as if I were some entry-level employee who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of real business. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I had learned long ago that correcting his assumptions only led to lectures about how I didn't understand the corporate hierarchy. That Friday evening, I stood in front of our bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue dress I'd chosen carefully. It was professional, yet elegant, expensive enough to fit in with the other executives' wives, but not so flashy as to draw unwanted attention. I'd learned to navigate these corporate social events like a diplomat, smiling at the right moments, asking the appropriate questions, and never, ever overshadowing my husband's carefully cultivated image. David emerged from his walk-in closet, adjusting his silver cufflinks with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this ritual hundreds of times. At 42, he still maintained the confident bearing that had first attracted me. In college, though, the years had added a layer of arrogance that sometimes made him feel like a stranger. "Remember," he said, checking his reflection one final time, "tonight is important for my positioning within the company. Richardson from the board will be there, and rumor has it they're considering promoting someone to Senior Vice President of Operations. I need to make the right impression." I nodded, applying one final coat of lipstick. David's career at Morrison Industries had always been his primary focus, and by extension, it had become mine as well. For the past 8 years, I'd attended these events as the supportive wife, listening to endless conversations about market strategies and profit margins while carefully monitoring my own behavior to ensure I reflected well on his professional reputation. The drive to the hotel was filled with David's last-minute coaching about which topics to avoid, which executives' wives I should make sure to compliment, and how to deflect any questions about my own work. "If anyone asks about your job, just keep it vague," he instructed, as we pulled into the valet station. "Say you work in human resources and change the subject. Nobody really wants to hear about employee handbook updates anyway." The Grand Metropolitan's ballroom was transformed into an elegant dining space, with round tables dressed in crisp white linens and centerpieces of white orchids that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. The lighting was warm and flattering, casting a golden glow over the assembled guests who moved through the space with the practiced ease of people accustomed to luxury. David immediately began working the room, his hand firmly placed on the small of my back as he guided me from group to group. I recognized most of the faces from previous events, colleagues from various departments and their spouses who had become familiar fixtures in our social orbit. The conversations followed predictable patterns: market performance, upcoming product launches, children's achievements at prestigious schools, and vacation plans to exotic destinations. "David, wonderful to see you," boomed Harold Richardson, the silver-haired board member whose approval David had been seeking for months. Richardson's wife, an elegant woman in her 60s, stood beside him, wearing what was undoubtedly a designer gown that cost more than my monthly salary. "Harold, thank you for hosting such a beautiful evening," David replied, his voice taking on the slightly formal tone he used with senior executives. "You remember my wife, Sarah." "Of course, lovely to see you again, Sarah," Richardson said, though I could tell he didn't actually remember me from the handful of previous encounters we'd had. "What is it you do again?" "I know David's mentioned it." Before I could respond, David jumped in with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sarah works in HR at a mid-sized consulting firm. Nothing too exciting, just the usual employee relations stuff. She keeps busy with paperwork and handling the occasional workplace drama." The dismissal in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, and I felt the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. Richardson nodded politely, already losing interest as David smoothly transitioned the conversation to his recent success with the Jackson account. This pattern repeated itself throughout the cocktail hour. Each time someone asked about my work, David would deflect with some variation of the same response, painting my career as insignificant compared to the real business being conducted by the men in the room. I smiled and played my part, asking about their wives' charity work and complimenting their jewelry, all while feeling increasingly invisible. The evening's low point came during dinner, when we found ourselves seated at a table with 3 other couples from Morrison's executive team. The conversation had turned to career achievements, with each of the men sharing stories of recent victories and upcoming challenges. Their wives listened with the practiced attention of women who had heard similar stories countless times before. "So Sarah," said Jennifer Walsh, the wife of Morrison's chief financial officer, "David mentioned you work in human resources. That must be challenging in today's environment, with all the new regulations and changing workplace dynamics." I felt a spark of hope that someone might actually be interested in my professional perspective. "Actually, it's fascinating work. The strategic integration of human capital management with organizational objectives requires—" "Oh, Sarah's being modest," David interrupted, his laugh cutting through my explanation. "She basically processes employee complaints and updates policies. Nothing too complex. The real strategic decisions happen at the executive level, right, guys?" The other men at the table chuckled knowingly, while their wives offered sympathetic smiles that made me feel like a child whose attempt at adult conversation had been gently corrected. I took a sip of wine and retreated back into the role of supportive spouse, asking safe questions about their children's schools and upcoming family vacations. As the evening progressed, I found myself studying the dynamics at our table with growing clarity. These women were all accomplished in their own right. Jennifer had been a successful marketing executive before having children. Maria had a PhD in economics, and Catherine ran a nonprofit that provided educational resources to underprivileged children. Yet here they sat, their identities subsumed into their roles as supportive wives, their own achievements minimized in favor of their husbands' professional narratives. The realization hit me with uncomfortable force. I had become one of them, not by choice, but by gradually accepting David's version of my worth and allowing it to define how I presented myself to the world. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped fighting for recognition of my own achievements and had settled into the comfortable but suffocating role of the wife who just works in HR. During the dessert course, Richardson stood to address the room, thanking everyone for their dedication to Morrison Industries and hinting at exciting changes ahead. "The company is entering a new phase of growth," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom. "We're implementing new leadership strategies that will position us for continued success in an evolving marketplace." David straightened in his chair, clearly interpreting this as validation of his upcoming promotion prospects. He leaned over to whisper in my ear, "This is it, Sarah. Everything we've worked for is finally paying off." Once I make senior VP, we'll be set. You might even be able to cut back on your hours and focus more on supporting my career." The assumption that my own career was expendable, merely a side project until his success was sufficient to support us both, struck me like a physical blow. I nodded and smiled, but inside, I was calculating the years I had spent minimizing my own ambitions to accommodate his. The promotions I had turned down because they would require travel that might conflict with his schedule. The networking, events I had skipped to attend his company functions. The opportunities I had let slip by because David's career always took precedence. After dinner, as we moved to the hotel's lounge for after-dinner drinks, I excused myself to the restroom. I needed a moment alone to process the evening's revelations and to check the messages that had been buzzing on my phone throughout dinner. Corporate etiquette dictated that phones remain silent during formal events, but the persistent notifications suggested something important was happening. In the elegant marble-appointed ladies' room, I finally looked at my phone. 7 missed calls and a dozen text messages, all from Margaret Chen, the executive recruiter who had been working with me for the past 3 months on what she called a career-defining opportunity. My heart rate quickened as I read her most recent message. "Sarah, need to speak with you immediately. The board has made their decision. Call me as soon as you can." I stepped into one of the private stalls and dialed Margaret's number, my hands trembling slightly as I waited for her to answer. "Sarah, thank God." Margaret's voice was electric with excitement. "I've been trying to reach you all evening. Are you sitting down?" "I'm at a company event," I said quietly, keeping my voice low. "What's happening?" "The Morrison Industries board met in emergency session this afternoon. They've made their decision about the CEO position, and Sarah." She paused for dramatic effect. "They want you. Unanimous vote. The offer is extraordinary, and they want your answer by Monday morning so they can announce next week." The words seemed to echo in the marble space around me, each syllable reshaping my understanding of reality. For 3 months, I had been secretly interviewing for executive positions at various companies, including Morrison Industries, but I had never allowed myself to believe that the top position was actually within reach. "I need to process this," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Can you email me the formal offer?" "Already sent," Margaret replied. "Sarah, this is it. This is the opportunity we've been working toward. They were specifically looking for someone with your background in organizational psychology and strategic human capital management. Your work at Sterling Consulting caught their attention, but your vision for integrated leadership development is what sold them." After hanging up, I remained in the stall for several minutes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. In a matter of minutes, my entire world had shifted on its axis. The woman who just works in HR had been offered the position of Chief Executive Officer at Morrison Industries, the same company where my husband desperately sought a Senior Vice President role. I returned to the lounge where David was engaged in animated conversation with Richardson and several other executives. As I approached the group, I heard him saying, "The key is understanding that real leadership requires making tough decisions that others can't handle. That's what separates executives from support staff." Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of leadership, we'll be making some significant announcements next week. The board has been working on succession planning, and we're bringing in new executive talent to guide the company forward." "I assume you'll be promoting from within," David said, his voice carrying a note of expectation. "After all, who knows the company better than the people who've been building it from the inside?" "Not necessarily," Richardson replied with a slight smile. "Sometimes fresh perspective is exactly what an organization needs. We've been impressed by some external candidates who bring innovative approaches to leadership development and organizational strategy. I watched David's face carefully, noting the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated his growing concern. He had built his entire career strategy around the assumption that loyalty and internal knowledge would be rewarded with advancement. The possibility that outsiders might leapfrog over him had clearly never seriously entered his calculations. "Well," David said, forcing a confident laugh, "I'm sure whoever you choose will have the experience to handle the complexities of executive leadership. It's not the kind of role you can just walk into without proper preparation." The irony of his words, given what I now knew about Monday's announcement, was almost overwhelming. I excused myself again, this time claiming I needed some fresh air, and stepped onto the hotel's terrace overlooking the city lights. The cool evening breeze helped clear my head as I considered the impossible situation I now found myself in. In less than 72 hours, I would be walking into Morrison Industries as the new chief executive officer, the person ultimately responsible for David's career trajectory and professional future. The husband who had spent the evening dismissing my work as insignificant paperwork would find himself reporting through several layers of management to me. I thought about the 12 years of our marriage, the countless times David had positioned himself as the serious professional, while treating my career as a hobby or distraction. The dinner parties where he would interrupt my conversations about strategic workforce development to redirect attention to his latest sales figures. The vacation planning sessions where his work schedule always took precedence over mine. The financial decisions where he assumed his opinion carried more weight because he understood business in ways I supposedly didn't. Standing on that terrace, looking out over the city where I would soon be leading one of its most prominent companies, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was vindication, certainly, and a satisfying sense of poetic justice. But there was also sadness for the years I had allowed David's perceptions to influence my own self-worth, and anxiety about how this revelation would impact our marriage. My phone buzzed with another message from Margaret. "Sarah, I know this is overwhelming, but I need to emphasize how rare this opportunity is. Morrison Industries is specifically looking to transform their leadership culture, and they believe your background in organizational psychology and human capital strategy makes you uniquely qualified to guide that transformation. This isn't just a job offer. It's a chance to reshape how major corporations think about leadership and employee development." I read the message twice, allowing the full significance to sink in. This wasn't simply about proving David wrong or achieving personal vindication. This was about the opportunity to implement the theories and strategies I had been developing throughout my career, to demonstrate that human-centered leadership could drive better business outcomes, and to create an organizational culture where employees like me wouldn't have to choose between authenticity and advancement. When I returned to the lounge, the evening was winding down. David was exchanging business cards with several executives, his networking efforts focused entirely on positioning himself for what he assumed would be his inevitable promotion. I watched him operate with the practiced charm he had perfected over years of corporate social events, never suspecting that the trajectory of his career was about to be fundamentally altered by the woman standing quietly beside him. As we said our goodbyes and waited for the valet to bring our car, Richardson approached me directly for the first time that evening. "Sarah, I hope you enjoyed the dinner," he said, his tone more personal than it had been during our earlier conversation. These events can be a bit overwhelming, especially when so much of the conversation focuses on business matters. "Actually, I find business conversations quite engaging," I replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Organizational dynamics and leadership development are areas I'm particularly passionate about." Richardson's eyebrows raised slightly, and I could see him reassessing his initial impressions. "Is that so? What's your perspective on the challenges facing companies like ours in terms of leadership development?" Before I could respond, David stepped between us, his hand once again finding its familiar position on my back. "Harold, you don't want to get Sarah started on organizational theory. he said with another dismissive laugh. She can talk for hours about employee satisfaction surveys and workplace culture. Very academic, but not particularly relevant to bottom-line business decisions. Richardson's expression grew thoughtful as he observed this interaction, and I had the distinct impression that he was filing away details for future consideration. Sometimes academic perspectives offer valuable insights, he said mildly. Fresh thinking can illuminate blind spots that industry veterans might miss. The drive home was filled with David's analysis of the evening's conversations and his predictions about upcoming organizational changes. He was particularly energized by Richardson's hints about new announcements, interpreting them as confirmation that his promotion was imminent. "Did you see how Richardson responded when I talked about the Jackson account?" he asked as we pulled into our driveway. He was clearly impressed, and when he mentioned bringing in new executive talent, I could tell he was thinking about internal promotions. "This is exactly what we've been working toward, Sarah." I murmured appropriate responses while my mind raced through the implications of Monday's announcement. How would David react when he learned that his wife, the woman he had spent years positioning as professionally insignificant, would soon be leading the company he had dedicated his career to? How would our marriage survive such a fundamental shift in our power dynamic? That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside me, already dreaming of his anticipated promotion. The formal offer from Morrison Industries was sitting in my email inbox, waiting for my response. Margaret had scheduled a call for Saturday morning to discuss the details and timeline for accepting the position. I thought about my journey to this moment, the path that had led from tonight's humiliation to tomorrow's opportunity. After completing my doctorate in organizational psychology at Northwestern, I had started my career in traditional human resources roles, but had quickly realized that the field's potential for strategic impact was vastly underutilized. Most companies treated HR as an administrative function rather than recognizing its potential as a driver of organizational effectiveness. My move to Sterling Consulting 5 years ago had been motivated by the desire to work with companies on transformative organizational development rather than simply managing employee policies and procedures. At Sterling, I had led initiatives that fundamentally reshaped how client companies approached leadership development, employee engagement, and organizational culture. My work had consistently demonstrated that companies with strong human capital strategies outperformed their peers across virtually every business metric. The recognition of my expertise had grown gradually within professional circles, leading to speaking engagements at industry conferences, published research in management, journals, and eventually the attention of executive recruiters representing major corporations seeking transformational leadership. The irony was that while my reputation was growing among business leaders and academic researchers, my own husband remained convinced that my work was insignificant compared to his sales achievements. Saturday morning arrived with Margaret's promised call, during which she walked me through the details of Morrison Industries' offer. The compensation package was substantial, far exceeding what David earned in his current role, but more importantly, the board had given me unprecedented authority to reshape the company's organizational structure and leadership development programs. "They want you to start immediately," Margaret explained. "The current CEO is retiring earlier than planned due to health concerns, and the board believes the company needs fresh leadership to navigate upcoming market challenges. They're particularly interested in your vision for integrated human capital, strategy, and sustainable organizational growth." As Margaret spoke, I found myself walking through our house, looking at the life David and I had built together over 12 years of marriage. The furniture we had chosen together, the photographs documenting our shared experiences, the gradual accumulation of possessions that represented our combined dreams and aspirations. Everything felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, as if I were seeing it all through new eyes. "Sarah, are you still there?" Margaret's voice brought me back to the conversation. Yes, I'm here. I'm just processing everything. This opportunity is incredible, but it's also going to fundamentally change my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. Change is never easy, Margaret acknowledged, but this is the kind of opportunity that comes along once in a career. You have the chance to prove that human-centered leadership isn't just theoretical. It can drive real business results at the highest levels of corporate America. After ending the call, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the books and research that had shaped my understanding of organizational leadership. Volumes on systems thinking, emotional intelligence, and sustainable business practices lined the shelves, representing years of study and professional development that David had always viewed as interesting hobbies rather than serious career preparation. I opened my laptop and began drafting my acceptance email to the Morrison Industries board. As I typed, I realized that this decision represented more than just a career change. It was a fundamental assertion of my own worth and capabilities after years of allowing others to define my value in diminished terms. The email was brief, but confident. I am honored to accept your offer to serve as Chief Executive Officer of Morrison Industries. I look forward to working with the board and executive team to implement the strategic vision we discussed during the interview process. I am available to begin immediately and would appreciate scheduling a transition meeting early next week to discuss implementation timelines and communication strategies. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit send. The rest of the weekend passed in a surreal haze. David spent Saturday afternoon playing golf with colleagues, returning home energized by conversations about upcoming changes at Morrison Industries. He had convinced himself that his promotion announcement was imminent, and his excitement was infectious, despite my knowledge of what Monday would actually bring. Sunday evening, as David prepared for what he assumed would be a routine week leading up to his anticipated promotion, I made my own preparations for the most significant professional transition of my career. I laid out the navy blue suit I planned to wear for my first day as CEO, reviewed my notes from the interview process, and mentally rehearsed the conversations I would need to have with David once the announcement became public. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The man who had spent Friday evening dismissing my career as insignificant paperwork would wake up Monday morning to discover that his wife had been chosen to lead the company he had dedicated his career to serving. The woman he had introduced as someone who just works in HR would soon be making strategic decisions that would shape his professional future. As I prepared for sleep Sunday night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Years of education, professional development, and strategic career choices had positioned me for this opportunity, but it had taken David's public dismissal of my worth to crystallize my determination to claim the recognition I had earned. Sometimes the most transformative moments arise not from success, but from the clarity that comes when others finally reveal how little they understand about who you really are and what you're capable of achieving. Monday morning would bring new challenges and opportunities, but it would also bring the satisfaction of proving that competence and vision matter more than assumptions and stereotypes. The real business decisions, as David had said Friday night, were indeed made by people. Like us, he just had no idea that us included his own wife. The woman who had been invisible at Friday's dinner would be impossible to ignore come Monday morning. And David was about to learn that underestimating someone based on limited perceptions can be the most costly mistake of all. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Seattle feel electric with possibility. I woke before my alarm, my body humming with nervous energy that had been building since I sent my acceptance email Saturday afternoon. David was still sleeping soundly beside me, completely unaware that this would be the last morning he'd wake up thinking he understood the hierarchy of our professional lives. I slipped quietly out of bed and into the shower, where the hot water helped calm my nerves while I mentally rehearsed the day ahead. At 9:30, I would be meeting with the Morrison Industries board for a final briefing before the 10 o'clock announcement to all employees. At 11, I had my first executive team meeting as CEO. And somewhere in between, David would discover that his wife wasn't just someone who worked in HR anymore. The irony wasn't lost on me as I selected my outfit for the day. The same navy suit I had considered wearing to David's company dinner on Friday would now serve as my armor for my first day as chief executive officer. I paired it with the pearl necklace my grandmother had given me, a reminder of the generations of strong women who had paved the way for moments like this. David stirred as I was applying my makeup, rolling over to check his phone for any urgent emails that might have arrived overnight. This was his routine every morning, scanning for developments that might affect his positioning within the company. Hierarchy. Today, he would find nothing because the most significant development in Morrison Industries' recent history was sitting at the vanity table 3 feet away from him. "You're up early," he mumbled, squinting at his phone screen. "Any particular reason, or just couldn't sleep?" "Important day at work," I replied, which was perhaps the greatest understatement I had ever made. "I want to make sure I'm prepared for everything." David nodded absently, already absorbed in his morning email review. "I should probably get moving too. Richardson mentioned they might be making some announcements today, and I want to be visible when the promotion discussions start happening." I continued applying my lipstick, watching his reflection in the mirror as he scrolled through messages that contained no hint of what was coming. Part of me wanted to prepare him somehow, to ease the shock that was only hours away. But another part of me, the part that had endured years of condescension and dismissal, wanted him to experience the same disorienting surprise I had felt countless times when he had undermined my professional credibility in public settings. "David," I said carefully, "what would you say if I told you that sometimes people aren't exactly what they appear to be on the surface?" He looked up from his phone with mild confusion. "What do you mean? Is this about something that happened at work?" "Not exactly. I just think sometimes we make assumptions about people based on limited information, and those assumptions can be completely wrong." David set his phone aside and gave me his attention, though I could see his impatience, to get back to his morning routine. "Sarah, is everything okay? You're being unusually philosophical for a Monday morning." "Everything's fine," I assured him. "I just think today might be full of surprises for both of us." He shrugged and returned to his phone, dismissing my comment as another example of what he often called my tendency toward unnecessary complexity. David preferred his world to be straightforward and predictable, with clear hierarchies and defined roles. The idea that his wife might be capable of surprising him professionally was so far outside his conceptual framework that he couldn't even process the hint I was trying to give him. I finished getting ready in silence, gathering my purse and the leather portfolio that contained my notes for the board meeting. As I headed toward the door, David called out from the bedroom, "Hey, good luck with whatever's happening at your office today. Try not to let the employee drama get to you too much." "Thanks," I replied, my hand on the doorknob. "I have a feeling today is going to be unlike anything that's happened before." The drive to Morrison Industries felt surreal, as if I were traveling through a familiar landscape that had somehow been transformed overnight. I had visited the building many times over the years for David's company events, but I had always entered as a spouse, a supporting character in someone else's professional story. Today, I would walk through those same doors as the person ultimately responsible for the company's direction and success. Margaret Chen was waiting for me in the lobby, her professional composure barely containing her excitement about the day's proceedings. As the executive recruiter who had orchestrated this placement, she understood better than anyone how significant this moment was, not just for my career, but for the broader conversation about leadership diversity in corporate America. "Sarah, you look absolutely perfect," she said as we rode the elevator to the executive floor. "The board is thrilled with your decision to accept, and they're eager to begin the transition process immediately." "How are they planning to handle the announcement?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the butterflies that had taken up permanent residence in my stomach. "Richardson will introduce you to the executive team first. Then there will be a company-wide video conference at 10. After that, they'll send out a press release to the business media. By noon, everyone in the city will know that Morrison Industries has a new CEO. The executive conference room was exactly as I remembered it from my final interview 3 weeks earlier, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline and the polished mahogany table that could seat 20 people comfortably. Today, only 8 board members were present, but their collective presence filled the room with an energy that was both welcoming and intimidating. Harold Richardson stood as I entered, his expression warm but businesslike. "Sarah, welcome to Morrison Industries. We're excited to begin this new chapter with your leadership." The next hour passed in a blur of strategic discussions, operational briefings, and administrative details. The board outlined their vision for my first 90 days, which included a comprehensive organizational assessment, the implementation of new leadership development programs, and the initiation of cultural transformation initiatives that would position Morrison Industries as a leader in progressive corporate governance. "The current executive team has been informed that we'll be bringing in new leadership," Richardson explained, "but they don't yet know your identity or background. Some may be surprised by our choice to go outside the organization for such a senior position." "I understand there may be some resistance to change," I replied, drawing on my years of experience managing organizational transitions. "My approach will be to listen first, understand the existing strengths and challenges, and then collaborate with the team to implement improvements that build on what's already working well." At 9:50, Richardson escorted me to the smaller conference room where the executive team was waiting. Through the glass wall, I could see 6 people seated around the table, including Thomas Harrison, the chief operating officer who had been serving as interim CEO since the previous leader's retirement announcement. Their expressions ranged from curious to skeptical, and I could sense their uncertainty about what this leadership change would mean for their own positions and responsibilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richardson began as we entered the room, "I'd like you to meet Morrison Industries' new Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Sarah Mitchell." The reaction was immediate and varied. Harrison stood quickly, extending his hand with professional courtesy despite what I imagined was disappointment about not being chosen for the permanent role himself. Janet Williams, the Chief Financial Officer, offered a warm smile that suggested genuine openness to new leadership. Marcus Thompson, the head of operations, appeared more reserved, his expression carefully neutral as he processed this unexpected development. Dr. Mitchell brings extensive experience in organizational psychology and strategic human capital management, Richardson continued. Her work at Sterling Consulting has consistently demonstrated that companies with strong leadership, development programs, and employee-centered cultures outperform their peers across all key business metrics. As Richardson spoke, I studied each face around the table, noting their reactions and beginning to form initial impressions of the dynamics I would be working with. These were accomplished professionals who had dedicated their careers to Morrison Industries, and I understood that earning their respect and collaboration would be crucial to the success of any transformation initiatives. "I'm honored to join such a talented team," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. "My immediate priority is to listen and learn from each of you about the company's strengths, challenges, and opportunities for growth. I believe the best solutions emerge from collaborative thinking rather than top-down mandates." The next 20 minutes were spent on introductions and initial discussions about immediate priorities. I was impressed by the team's knowledge and commitment, though I could sense underlying tensions about the direction the company should take. Some seemed energized by the prospect of change, while others appeared more cautious about disrupting established systems and processes. At exactly 10 o'clock, Richardson's assistant knocked on the conference room door to signal that it was time for the company-wide announcement. We moved to the large auditorium where Morrison Industries held its quarterly meetings, with video connections to regional offices around the country. As we entered, I could see the puzzled expressions of employees who were clearly speculating about what this unexpected gathering might mean. Richardson took the podium first, his voice carrying easily through the sound system to the assembled crowd. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to join us for an important announcement about Morrison Industries' leadership transition. I stood at the side of the stage, my heart racing as I prepared for the moment that would fundamentally alter not just my professional life, but my personal relationships as well. Somewhere in this building, David was probably watching this announcement on his computer screen, expecting to hear about organizational changes that might affect his promotion prospects. He had no idea that his wife was about to walk onto that stage. As you know, we began a comprehensive search for new executive leadership several months ago, Richardson continued. The board was committed to finding someone who could build on Morrison Industries' strong foundation while bringing fresh perspectives on leadership development and organizational excellence. Through the auditorium's large windows, I could see the city skyline where David and I had built our life together over the past 12 years. In a few moments, that life would be forever changed by what happened on this stage. There would be no going back to the comfortable patterns of our marriage, where he was the serious professional and I was the supportive spouse with the insignificant career. It's my pleasure to introduce Morrison Industries' new Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Sarah Mitchell. As I walked onto the stage, the applause was polite but subdued, reflecting the natural uncertainty that accompanies any major leadership change. I could see employees throughout the auditorium trying to place me, some recognizing me from company events, but unable to understand how David's wife had suddenly appeared as their new leader. Standing at the podium, looking out over an audience that included my husband somewhere in the crowd, I felt a moment of profound clarity about the journey that had brought me to this point. Years of education, professional development, and strategic career choices had prepared me for this opportunity, but it had taken David's public dismissal of my worth to give me the clarity and determination to claim the recognition I had earned. Thank you, Harold, and good morning, everyone, I began, my voice steady despite the enormity of the moment. I'm honored to join Morrison Industries as your new CEO, and I'm excited about the opportunity to work with all of you to build on this company's impressive legacy while preparing for future challenges and opportunities. As I spoke, I could see employees in the audience beginning to recognize me, their expressions shifting from confusion to surprise as they realized that David Mitchell's wife was now addressing them as their new leader. I caught glimpses of people whispering to their colleagues, undoubtedly trying to process this unexpected development. My background is in organizational psychology and strategic human capital management, I continued. And my approach to leadership is built on the belief that companies succeed when they create environments where employees can contribute their best thinking and highest levels of engagement. Over the coming weeks, I'll be meeting with teams throughout the organization to listen and learn about your experiences, challenges, and ideas for improvement. The presentation continued for another 15 minutes, outlining my vision for Morrison Industries' future and my commitment to maintaining the company's financial performance while enhancing its reputation as an employer of choice. As I spoke, I could see the audience gradually warming to my message, particularly the younger employees who seemed energized by the prospect of leadership that prioritized employee development alongside business results. When I concluded my remarks and opened the floor for questions, the first hand that went up belonged to Jennifer Walsh from the marketing department. I recognized her as someone David had worked with on several projects, and I could see the confusion in her expression as she tried to reconcile the woman she knew as David's wife with the executive now standing before her. Dr. Mitchell, she began carefully. Could you tell us more about your vision for integrating employee development with business strategy, and how that might differ from our current approaches? It was a thoughtful question that allowed me to elaborate on the research-based methodologies I would be implementing. As I answered, I noticed several employees taking notes, suggesting genuine interest in the changes I was proposing. This was exactly the kind of engagement I had hoped to see, and it reinforced my confidence that Morrison Industries was ready for the transformation I had been hired to lead. After the formal presentation, Richardson invited me to join him for a brief press conference with local business media. As we walked toward the executive conference room where reporters were waiting, he shared his satisfaction with how the announcement had been received. "The employees seem genuinely interested in your leadership approach," he observed. "I think you'll find that most people here are ready for change, even if they're not entirely sure what that change will look like." The media questions were predictable but important for establishing my credibility with the broader business community. Reporters asked about my background, my strategic priorities, and my plans for maintaining Morrison Industries' competitive position in a challenging market environment. I answered each question confidently, drawing on years of research and consulting experience to provide specific examples of how human-centered leadership approaches had generated measurable business results for other organizations. One reporter from the Seattle Business Journal asked the question I had been expecting. "Dr. Mitchell, some might view your appointment as unconventional, given that you're coming from outside the company and the industry. How do you respond to potential skepticism about your qualifications for this role?" "I understand that my background may be different from what people expect in a traditional CEO," I replied, "but I believe that's exactly why the board chose me. The challenges facing companies today require fresh perspectives on leadership, employee engagement, and organizational effectiveness. My research and consulting work has consistently demonstrated that companies with strong human capital strategies outperform their peers, and I'm excited about the opportunity to prove that principle at Morrison Industries." As the press conference concluded, I realized that the morning's events had accomplished exactly what I had hoped. The announcement had been professional and well-received, my credibility had been established with both employees and media, and the foundation had been laid for the organizational changes I wanted to implement. But I also knew that the most challenging conversation of the day was still ahead of me. David would undoubtedly be looking for me, needing to understand how his wife had suddenly become the most powerful person at his company. That conversation would require all the diplomatic skills I had developed over years of navigating complex organizational dynamics. Richardson's assistant approached as I was gathering my materials. "Dr. Mitchell, there are several people asking to speak with you. Should I schedule appointments, or would you prefer to handle these conversations informally?" "What kind of conversations are we talking about?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Well, there's your husband David from the sales department. He seems quite eager to speak with you. There are also several employees who want to congratulate you and ask about upcoming changes. And 3 department heads would like to schedule transition meetings." I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult part of this entire day. "Please ask David to wait in my office. I'll speak with him first, then we can schedule the other meetings." The walk to what was now my executive office felt like the longest journey of my professional life. Through the glass walls of the conference rooms I passed, I could see employees engaged in animated discussions about the morning's announcement. Some looked excited about the prospect of change, while others appeared more cautious about what new leadership might mean for their established routines and responsibilities. My new office was impressive, with panoramic views of the Seattle skyline and elegant furnishings that reflected the seriousness of the position I now held. But as I opened the door, all I could focus on was David standing by the window, his expression a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and something that looked disturbingly like anger. "Sarah," he said without turning around, his voice carefully controlled in the way that indicated he was struggling to manage his emotions. "I think we need to talk." I closed the door behind me and moved to the seating area, gesturing for him to join me on the comfortable chairs that were positioned for private conversations. "I imagine you have questions about this morning's announcement." David finally turned to face me, and I could see the full impact of the day's revelations in his expression. The man who had spent Friday evening dismissing my career as insignificant. Paperwork was now confronting the reality that his wife had been chosen to lead the company he had dedicated his career to serving. "Questions?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. "Sarah, how is this possible? When did this happen? How long have you been interviewing for executive positions without telling me?" I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind over the weekend, but facing David's actual reaction was more difficult than I had anticipated. This wasn't just about professional hierarchies or corporate politics. This was about 12 years of marriage, about trust and communication, about the fundamental assumptions that had shaped our relationship. "The board approached me 3 months ago," I said calmly. "The initial contact came through my work at Sterling Consulting. Margaret Chen, the executive recruiter, had been following my research on organizational effectiveness, and Morrison Industries was specifically looking for someone with my background in strategic human capital management." David sat down heavily, in the chair across from me, running his hands through his hair in the gesture I recognized as his response to overwhelming stress. 3 months, Sarah. You've been interviewing for my company's top position for 3 months, and you never said a word." "I was bound by confidentiality agreements," I explained, though I knew that wasn't the complete truth. "Executive searches, at this level, require absolute discretion. The board couldn't risk information leaking before they were ready to make their decision." "But I'm your husband," David said, his voice carrying a note of genuine hurt that made my heart ache. "We're supposed to be partners. How could you keep something this significant from me?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that my answer would set the tone for whatever our relationship became after this moment. I could offer explanations about confidentiality requirements and professional obligations, but the real truth was more complicated and more painful. "David," I said carefully, "when was the last time you asked me about my work? When was the last time you showed genuine interest in my career aspirations or professional challenges?" His expression shifted, defensive now, rather than just hurt. "That's not fair, Sarah. I've always been supportive of your career. I've never tried to stop you from pursuing your interests." "Supporting my career and being interested in my career are two different things," I replied. "For years, you've treated my work as a hobby, something I do to keep busy while you handle the serious business of building our financial security. You've introduced me to colleagues as someone who just works in HR and dismissed my expertise as irrelevant to real business decisions." David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing not just the facts of what had happened, but the implications of what I was saying about our relationship dynamics. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been. "I never meant to diminish your work, Sarah. I thought you were happy with your consulting practice. You never talked about wanting to move into executive leadership." "I never talked about it because every time I tried to discuss strategic career planning, you would redirect the conversation to your own advancement prospects," I said, feeling years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. "Do you remember last year when I mentioned the possibility of pursuing a corporate leadership role? You told me I should focus on building my consulting client base instead of getting distracted by unrealistic ambitions." The words seemed to hit David like physical blows, and I could see him remembering conversations where he had dismissed my aspirations without really hearing them. The comfortable patterns of our marriage, where his career took precedence and mine provided supplemental income and flexible scheduling, had blinded him to the possibility that I might have ambitions that extended beyond supporting his success. "So this is about proving me wrong," he said, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand that the situation was more complex than simple vindication. "No, David. This is about accepting an opportunity that aligns with my education, experience, and professional goals. The fact that it happens to be at your company is coincidental, though I understand it creates complications for both of us." David stood and walked back to the window, looking out over the city where we had built our life together. When he spoke again, his voice carried a resignation that suggested he was beginning to grasp the full magnitude of what had changed between us. What happens now, Sarah? How do we navigate this? You're going to be making decisions that affect my career, my future with this company. How do we separate our personal relationship from our professional obligations? It was a fair question, and one I had been grappling with since accepting the position. We'll need to establish clear boundaries between home and work. At Morrison Industries, I'm the CEO and you're a sales manager. Those roles have specific responsibilities and reporting relationships that we'll need to respect. At home, we're still married, still partners, still committed to making our relationship work despite these new complexities. And what if those roles conflict? David asked. What if you have to make decisions that negatively impact my career? What if I disagree with your leadership choices? How do we handle that kind of tension? I had been dreading this question because I knew there was no easy answer. The reality was that our personal and professional lives were now inextricably intertwined in ways that would test both our marriage and our individual integrity. We'll handle it the same way any married couple handles professional disagreements, I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. We'll communicate openly at home about our concerns and perspectives, but we'll maintain appropriate professional behavior at work. You'll report to your department manager, who reports to the sales director, who reports to me. That chain of command will be respected regardless of our personal relationship. David nodded slowly, though I could see he was still struggling to process the fundamental shift in our dynamic. For 12 years, he had been the primary breadwinner, the one with the impressive title and the strategic career plan. Now, suddenly, he was married to his ultimate boss, and everything he thought, he understood about our relationship had been turned upside down. I need time to process this, Sarah, he said finally. This morning, I woke up thinking I understood my life, my marriage, my career prospects. Now I don't know what to think about any of it. I understand, I replied, and I genuinely did. This is a massive adjustment for both of us. We don't have to figure everything out today. As David prepared to leave my office, he turned back with one final question. The announcement about new executive leadership that Richardson mentioned last week. You knew what he was talking about, didn't you? You knew I was hoping for a promotion that was never going to happen because they were bringing you in instead. The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and I realized that his hurt went beyond just being surprised by my appointment. He felt deceived about his own career prospects, led to believe in possibilities that had never actually existed. The board made their decision weeks ago, I admitted. I'm sorry you weren't given more realistic information about the leadership transition timeline. David nodded once, then left my office without another word. Through the glass wall, I watched him walk down the hallway with the careful composure of someone trying to maintain professional dignity despite personal turmoil. I knew that the next few weeks would be challenging for both of us as we learned to navigate our new reality. But I also felt a profound sense of relief that the secret was finally out. For 3 months, I had been living a double life, maintaining the pretense of being the supportive wife with the modest career, while secretly preparing for the most significant professional opportunity of my life. Now, finally, I could be authentic about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The rest of the day was filled with meetings, briefings, and administrative tasks that came with assuming leadership of a major corporation. I met with each department head individually, listening to their perspectives on the company's strengths and challenges. I reviewed financial reports and strategic plans. I began the process of understanding the organizational culture I would be working to transform. Through it all, I was acutely aware that hundreds of employees throughout the building were adjusting to the reality that David Mitchell's wife was now their CEO. Some seemed energized by the prospect of new leadership. while others appeared more cautious about what changes might be coming. All of them were undoubtedly curious about how this unusual situation would affect the workplace dynamics they had grown accustomed to. As the day drew to a close, I received a text message from Margaret Chen. "Congratulations on a successful first day. The business media coverage has been overwhelmingly positive, and the board is thrilled with how you handled the transition. Well done." I sat in my new office as the sun set over Seattle, reflecting on the extraordinary day that had transformed me from the invisible wife at Friday's dinner party to the visible leader of one of the city's most prominent companies. The journey ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, both professionally and personally, but I felt ready for whatever came next. The woman who had been dismissed as someone who just works in HR was now responsible for shaping the future of Morrison Industries and the careers of everyone who worked there, including her own husband. It was a responsibility I was honored to accept, and a challenge I was determined to meet with all the skill, wisdom, and integrity I could bring to bear. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove that leadership based on human capital, development, and organizational psychology could drive exceptional business results. But tonight, I simply wanted to savor the satisfaction of finally being recognized for who I really was and what I was truly capable of achieving. The foundation for everything that happened in my corner office that Monday afternoon was built over decades of choices, experiences, and gradual awakenings that neither David nor I fully understood until they collided in the most unexpected way possible. Looking back now, I can trace the threads that led to that moment when my husband discovered I would be his ultimate boss. But at the time, each decision felt isolated. Each step forward seemed incremental rather than revolutionary. My journey toward executive leadership began long before I met David, rooted in a childhood that taught me to see beyond surface appearances and question conventional wisdom about success and achievement. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, the daughter of two public school teachers who believed passionately in the power of education to transform lives and communities. My parents, Linda and Robert Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1970s with advanced degrees and big dreams, only to discover that their foreign credentials meant starting over in a system that didn't immediately recognize their expertise. My father eventually found his way into engineering consulting, while my mother built a reputation as one of the city's most innovative mathematics teachers. But their early struggles with credential recognition and workplace discrimination left lasting impressions on me about how organizations often failed to recognize talent that didn't fit traditional molds. From an early age, I watched my parents navigate systems that undervalued their contributions, while they quietly revolutionized how their colleagues thought about problem-solving and student engagement. The dinner table conversations in our house rarely focused on conventional markers of success like salary figures or job titles. Instead, my parents talked about impact, about the students whose lives were changed by innovative teaching methods, about the engineering projects that improved community infrastructure, about the satisfaction that came from work that mattered beyond immediate financial rewards. These discussions shaped my understanding that meaningful success required alignment between personal values and professional contributions. In high school, I gravitated toward psychology and social sciences, fascinated by the complex dynamics that influenced human behavior in group settings. My senior year project examined how different leadership styles affected student council effectiveness, a seemingly simple study that opened my eyes to the profound impact that organizational culture could have on individual performance and collective outcomes. My psychology teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, recognized something in my analytical approach that went beyond typical teenage academic interests. "Sarah," she told me during one of our after-class discussions, "you have an unusual ability to see systems, rather than just individual behaviors. That's a rare gift, and one that could make a real difference in how organizations function." Her encouragement led me to pursue undergraduate studies in psychology at Stanford University, where I initially planned to focus on clinical practice. But during my sophomore year, I took an elective course in organizational behavior that fundamentally shifted my career trajectory. Professor Jennifer Walsh, a former corporate consultant turned academic researcher, introduced concepts that connected individual psychological principles with large-scale organizational effectiveness. Most companies treat human resources as a necessary expense rather than recognizing human capital as their primary competitive advantage, Professor Walsh explained during one memorable lecture. The organizations that figure out how to optimize human potential while maintaining authentic care for employee well-being will dominate their industries for decades to come. That lecture sparked what would become my life's work, though I didn't realize it at the time. I changed my major to organizational psychology and began conducting undergraduate research on the relationship between employee engagement and business performance. My thesis project, which examined how leadership communication styles affected productivity in technology startups, won the university's award for outstanding undergraduate research and caught the attention of graduate school recruiters. From across the country, Northwestern University offered me a full fellowship for doctoral studies in organizational psychology, with the opportunity to work alongside Dr. Michael Harrison, whose research on sustainable leadership practices was reshaping how business schools taught management theory. The 5 years I spent in Chicago pursuing my PhD were intellectually transformative, exposing me to cutting-edge research on topics like emotional intelligence in leadership, the neuroscience of decision-making, and the psychology of organizational change. My dissertation research focused on what I called integrated value creation, examining how companies could simultaneously optimize financial performance, employee satisfaction, and social impact through strategic human capital management. The study involved extensive fieldwork with 12 companies across different industries, analyzing their leadership practices, organizational cultures, and long-term performance outcomes. The results were striking. Companies that prioritized authentic employee development and stakeholder-centered decision-making consistently outperformed their peers across multiple metrics, including profitability, innovation, and market position. Dr. Harrison encouraged me to present my findings at academic conferences, where they generated significant interest from both researchers and practicing executives. "Your work represents the future of business leadership," he told me as I prepared for graduation. "The question is whether you want to influence that future from academia or from inside the corporate world itself." It was during my final year of graduate school that I met David at a Northwestern alumni networking event in Chicago. He had graduated from the business school 3 years earlier and was working as a financial analyst at a consulting firm, already displaying the ambition and confidence that would define his career trajectory. David was handsome, articulate, and refreshingly direct about his professional goals. He wanted to build wealth, gain influence, and establish himself as a significant player in the business world. Our early conversations revealed both compatibilities and fundamental differences in how we thought about success and achievement. David was impressed by my academic accomplishments and research expertise, but he viewed them primarily as interesting intellectual pursuits rather than practical preparation for serious business leadership. In his worldview, real business happened in sales departments, investment firms, and executive suites, not in research labs or consulting practices focused on organizational culture. "Your work is fascinating," he would tell me during our dating phase, "but at some point, you'll want to transition into roles with more direct business impact. Academia is great for developing theoretical frameworks, but practical business success requires understanding market dynamics and financial performance." I was attracted to David's confidence and clarity about his goals, even as I sometimes felt misunderstood regarding my own professional aspirations. He seemed to see my research as preparation for a traditional corporate career, rather than recognizing that organizational psychology could be a strategic business discipline in its own right. But we were young, in love, and convinced that our different perspectives would complement each other rather than create long-term tensions. After completing my PhD, I accepted a position with McKinsey & Company's organizational effectiveness practice, thinking that management consulting would provide the business credibility David valued, while allowing me to apply my research expertise to real-world challenges. The work was intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding, involving projects with Fortune 500 companies that were struggling with leadership transitions, cultural transformations, and employee engagement issues. David and I married during my second year at McKinsey, a beautiful ceremony in Portland surrounded by family and friends who celebrated our partnership as the union of two ambitious professionals with complementary skills and shared dreams. Our early married years felt like a perfect balance of individual achievement and mutual support. David's career in investment banking was flourishing, while my consulting work was gaining recognition within McKinsey's organizational practice. But gradually, subtle patterns began emerging that would eventually shape the dynamics revealed in my office that Monday afternoon. David's professional success came with increasing social obligations, company events where spouses were expected to play supportive roles rather than engage as equals in business conversations. At these gatherings, I found myself introduced as David's wife, rather than as a consultant with expertise in organizational effectiveness. When people asked about my work, David would often answer for me, describing my role in general terms. That minimized the strategic nature of what I actually did. "Sarah helps companies with their people management challenges," became his standard response, a description that made my work sound like administrative support rather than strategic consulting. When I attempted to provide more detailed explanations of my projects, David would often redirect conversations toward topics he considered more relevant to his own networking objectives. Initially, I attributed these patterns to the social dynamics of David's industry rather than to any intentional dismissal of my professional credibility. Investment banking culture was notoriously hierarchical and male-dominated, and I assumed that David was simply adapting to expectations about appropriate spousal behavior in those settings. I convinced myself that his support for my career was evident in our private conversations, even if he didn't advocate for my professional recognition in public forums. But after 3 years at McKinsey, I began feeling constrained by the limitations of external consulting. While I enjoyed solving complex organizational problems, I found myself wanting to implement solutions rather than simply recommending them to client executives who might or might not follow through on proposed changes. The most rewarding aspects of my work involved multi-year engagements where I could see the long-term impact of cultural and leadership interventions. But those opportunities were rare in a consulting model designed around shorter-term projects. When I discussed my growing interest in transitioning to an internal corporate role, David was surprisingly resistant to the idea. "You're building such a strong reputation at McKinsey," he argued. "Why would you want to give up that prestige? To become someone's employee? Consulting gives you independence and variety that you'd lose in a traditional corporate position." His response puzzled me, particularly since he had previously expressed the view that consulting was somehow less real than traditional business roles. But as we discussed the matter further, I began to understand his underlying concerns. David's career strategy was built around networking and relationship building within Seattle's business community, and my position at a prestigious consulting firm enhanced his social capital in ways that an internal corporate role might not. "Think about it practically," he continued. "As a McKinsey consultant, you have access to executives across multiple companies. As someone's employee, you're just another face in their organizational chart. Which position gives you more influence and recognition?" The conversation revealed how differently we thought about influence and recognition. David measured professional success primarily through external validation and social positioning, while I was more interested in the depth of impact I could create through sustained organizational transformation. His definition of influence focused on breadth of connections and visibility within business networks, while mine emphasized the ability to create lasting positive change within specific organizations. Despite David's reservations, I decided to explore internal opportunities, motivated by my growing conviction that sustainable organizational change required leadership commitment over extended timeframes. Through my McKinsey network, I learned about Sterling Consulting, a smaller firm that specialized in long-term organizational development partnerships with companies committed to cultural transformation. Sterling's model involved embedding consultants within client organizations for multi-year engagements, providing the continuity and depth of involvement I was seeking. The transition to Sterling represented a significant shift in my career trajectory, though David continued to view it as a lateral move within the consulting industry, rather than recognizing it as strategic positioning for eventual executive leadership. At Sterling, I led engagements with companies that were serious about transforming their organizational cultures, implementing comprehensive leadership development programs, and creating workplace environments that optimized both employee satisfaction and business performance. My work at Sterling consistently demonstrated that companies investing in authentic human capital development outperformed their peers across virtually every business metric. Organizations that prioritized employee engagement, leadership effectiveness, and cultural alignment showed higher profitability, greater innovation, improved customer satisfaction, and stronger long-term market positions. These weren't just feel-good initiatives, they were strategic business advantages that created sustainable competitive differentiation. One of my most successful Sterling engagements involved a 3-year partnership with Pacific Manufacturing, a mid-sized company that was struggling with high turnover, low employee engagement, and declining market share. Working directly with the CEO and executive team, I implemented comprehensive leadership development programs, redesigned performance management systems, and created cultural initiatives that fundamentally transformed how the company operated. The results were remarkable. Over the 3-year partnership, Pacific Manufacturing reduced turnover by 60%, increased employee engagement scores by 40 points, and achieved record profitability while expanding into new markets. More importantly, the cultural transformation created a self-sustaining cycle of improvement, where employees felt empowered to contribute innovative ideas and take ownership of company success. The Pacific Manufacturing engagement established my reputation within the organizational development community and led to speaking opportunities at industry conferences, where I presented research on the business case for human-centered leadership. My presentations consistently drew large audiences of executives who were beginning to recognize that traditional command and control management approaches were insufficient for competing in rapidly evolving markets. But even as my professional reputation was growing within business circles, David's perception of my work remained limited by his focus on traditional indicators of corporate success. He was proud of my speaking engagements and the recognition I received from industry publications, but he continued to view organizational consulting as peripheral to real business, rather than recognizing it as preparation for executive leadership. "Your conference presentations are impressive," he would tell friends and colleagues. "But Sarah's really more of an academic researcher than a business executive. She's great with theories and employee satisfaction surveys, but the heavy lifting of business strategy and financial management requires different skill sets." These comments became increasingly frustrating as I began to understand that David's assessment of my capabilities was based on outdated assumptions about the division between soft skills and hard business skills. In his mental framework, human resources and organizational development were support functions that served real business operations, rather than recognizing them as strategic capabilities that could drive competitive advantage. The irony was that my work at Sterling was providing exactly the kind of strategic business experience that prepared leaders for executive roles. I was working directly with CEOs and boards of directors, analyzing complex organizational challenges, developing comprehensive transformation strategies, and implementing changes that generated measurable business results. These experiences were teaching me how to think systemically about business performance, while understanding the human dynamics that ultimately determined organizational success. During my 4th year at Sterling, I began receiving calls from executive recruiters who had been following my work and were interested in discussing corporate leadership opportunities. Initially, I was flattered, but not seriously interested, assuming that my non-traditional background would limit me to chief human resources officer roles rather than general management positions. But Margaret Chen, the recruiter who would eventually connect me with Morrison Industries, helped me understand that the business world was beginning to recognize the strategic value of leaders with deep expertise in organizational effectiveness. Companies are realizing that their primary competitive advantage lies in their ability to attract, develop, and retain talented people, she explained during our first conversation. Executives who understand how to optimize human capital while driving business results are becoming extremely valuable in the marketplace. Margaret's perspective challenged me to think more ambitiously about my career trajectory and to recognize that my combination of academic research, consulting experience, and proven business results had prepared me for senior executive roles in ways that traditional business backgrounds might not. She encouraged me to consider general management positions where my expertise in organizational psychology could be applied to comprehensive business leadership, rather than being confined to human resources functions. The most successful companies of the next decade will be those led by executives who understand that business performance and human development are not competing priorities, Margaret told me. Your background positions you to be exactly that kind of leader. These conversations occurred during a period when David's own career was reaching new heights of success. He had been promoted to senior vice president at his investment firm and was being courted by larger companies offering even more prestigious positions. His confidence in his professional trajectory was at an all-time high, and he began making assumptions about our future that reflected his belief that his career would always be the primary driver of our major life decisions. "Once I make partner," he told me one evening as we discussed potential moves to larger markets, "you'll have more flexibility to pursue passion projects or maybe start your own consulting practice. We won't need two high-stress careers once my income reaches a certain level." The suggestion that my career was optional, something I pursued for personal fulfillment rather than professional necessity, revealed how little David understood about my actual ambitions and motivations. In his mind, I was building expertise and experience that would eventually support a lifestyle business or hobby consulting practice, not preparing for executive leadership that could rival or exceed his own professional achievements. When Margaret first mentioned the Morrison Industries opportunity, I was intrigued but cautious. The CEO search was highly confidential, involving a board of directors that was specifically looking for someone with non-traditional business background who could bring fresh perspectives to organizational leadership. The company was performing well financially, but was struggling with employee retention, cultural cohesion, and innovation challenges that traditional business leaders had been unable to address effectively. They want someone who understands that sustainable business success requires more than just financial engineering, Margaret explained. They're looking for a leader who can integrate human capital strategy with business strategy in ways that create lasting competitive advantage. The initial conversations with Morrison Industries board members were unlike any job interviews I had experienced. Rather than focusing primarily on my resume and past achievements, they were interested in my philosophy of leadership, my vision for organizational effectiveness, and my ideas about how companies could create value for multiple stakeholders simultaneously. These discussions revealed a board that was genuinely committed to transformative leadership rather than simply seeking someone to maintain existing approaches. Harold Richardson, the board chairman, was particularly interested in my research on integrated value creation and how those principles could be applied at the scale of a major corporation. "We've been successful using traditional business models," he told me during one of our meetings, "but we're convinced that continued success requires evolving our approach to leadership and organizational culture. We need someone who can guide that evolution while maintaining our financial performance." The interview process extended over 3 months, involving multiple meetings with board members, strategic planning sessions, and detailed discussions about implementation timelines and success metrics. Throughout this period, I maintained absolute confidentiality about the opportunity, bound by non-disclosure agreements, but also by my own uncertainty about whether this was the right move for my career and my marriage. The decision to pursue the Morrison Industries opportunity was complicated by the growing recognition that accepting such a position would fundamentally alter my relationship with David. No longer would I be the supportive spouse with the interesting consulting career. I would be a corporate CEO with ultimate responsibility for business performance and strategic direction. David's own career aspirations within Morrison Industries would become secondary to my leadership priorities, a reversal of the dynamic that had characterized our entire marriage. But I was also beginning to understand that my career development had reached a point where continued growth required taking on comprehensive leadership responsibility rather than remaining in advisory roles. The sterling engagements had proven that I could drive organizational transformation and business results. But they had also shown me the limitations of external consulting compared to the sustained impact possible through direct executive leadership. The final interview session with Morrison Industries board took place on a Thursday afternoon in late summer, 3 weeks before David's company dinner, where he would dismiss my career as insignificant paperwork. During that meeting, Richardson and the other board members outlined their vision for the company's future and explained why they believed my background made me uniquely qualified to lead that transformation. "We're not looking for someone to manage Morrison Industries as it exists today," Richardson explained. "We're looking for someone to evolve Morrison Industries into the kind of company that will thrive in rapidly changing markets while creating positive value for employees, customers, and communities, as well as shareholders." The board's commitment to comprehensive value creation rather than narrow financial optimization aligned perfectly with my own professional philosophy and the research that had guided my career development. This was the opportunity I had been preparing for throughout my academic studies and consulting experience, even when I hadn't consciously recognized that preparation. When they offered me the position, the decision felt both inevitable and terrifying. Inevitable because it represented the logical culmination of everything I had learned and accomplished over the past decade. Terrifying because accepting it would force confrontations with assumptions and patterns that David and I had never directly addressed in our marriage. The weekend I spent deciding whether to accept the CEO offer was filled with long walks through our neighborhood, where I tried to imagine how fundamentally our lives would change if I took on such a prominent leadership role. David was playing golf with colleagues, completely unaware that his wife was contemplating a decision that would transform their relationship in ways neither of them had ever anticipated. By Sunday evening, I had reached clarity about the choice I needed to make. This opportunity represented not just personal achievement, but the chance to prove that leadership approaches based on human capital development and organizational psychology could drive exceptional business results. Accepting the position would allow me to implement theories I had been developing for years and to demonstrate that companies could create sustainable competitive advantage through authentic investment in employee development and stakeholder value. The potential impact extended beyond Morrison Industries itself. Success in this role could influence how other companies thought about leadership and organizational effectiveness, creating ripple effects throughout the business community. I had the chance to prove that different approaches to executive leadership could generate superior long-term results while creating more positive workplace cultures. When I sent my acceptance email to the board that Sunday evening, I was committing not just to a new job, but to a fundamental shift in how I understood my own capabilities and ambitions. The woman who had been systematically underestimated by her own husband was about to become one of the most powerful business leaders in Seattle, responsible for decisions that would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in shareholder value. The 3 weeks between accepting the position and the company dinner where David would publicly dismiss my work were filled with preparation activities that I couldn't share with the person closest to me. I worked with Margaret on transition planning, reviewed comprehensive briefing materials about Morrison Industries operations, and participated in confidential meetings with board members about strategic priorities and implementation timelines. Throughout this period, David continued operating under assumptions about our relationship and career trajectories that were about to be dramatically disrupted. He talked excitedly about his own advancement prospects at Morrison Industries, completely unaware that his wife was about to become the person ultimately responsible for evaluating those prospects. He made plans for our future that assumed his career would continue to be the primary factor in major decisions, not knowing that my new position would require him to adapt to entirely different circumstances. The morning of the company dinner, as I selected my outfit and prepared for what I expected to be another evening of playing the supportive spouse role, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. Years of education, research, and consulting experience had prepared me for executive leadership in ways that neither David nor I had fully recognized. The organizational psychology principles I had studied and applied throughout my career had given me unique insights into how companies could optimize both human potential and business performance. But it had taken the Morrison Industries opportunity to help me understand that my background was not just academically interesting or useful for consulting projects. It was preparation for transformative leadership that could reshape how major corporations approach the fundamental challenges of competing in rapidly evolving markets while creating positive value for all stakeholders. The woman who would walk into that company dinner believing she was David's supportive spouse with the modest consulting career was actually an accomplished executive leader whose expertise was about to be recognized at the highest levels of corporate America. The transformation had been happening gradually over years of professional development, but it would become visible all at once when David discovered that his assumptions about our relative professional status had been completely wrong. Standing in our bedroom that Friday evening, applying makeup for what I assumed would be another night of being introduced as someone who just works in HR, I had no idea that this would be the last time I would attend a Morrison Industries event as anyone other than the CEO. The journey from that moment of invisibility to Monday morning's announcement had been years in the making, built on foundations of expertise and experience that David had never fully understood or appreciated. The irony was that everything he would discover about my capabilities on Monday morning had been there all along, visible to anyone who was willing to see beyond traditional assumptions about career hierarchies and professional achievement. The board of directors had recognized what David had missed, that the future of business leadership belonged to people who could integrate human development with strategic business thinking, creating organizations that generated superior long-term results through authentic investment in their most important asset, their people. The revelation that would shock David and transform our marriage was simply the natural outcome of a career trajectory that had been building momentum for years. The only surprise was that it had taken so long for the recognition to come, and that when it finally arrived, it would come in the form of an opportunity that placed me in direct authority over the husband who had never quite understood what his wife was truly capable of achieving. The 3 weeks following my appointment as CEO of Morrison Industries unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of change, tension, and revelation. Each day brought new challenges that tested not only my leadership capabilities, but also the fundamental assumptions that had governed my personal relationships for over a decade. The woman who had been invisible at corporate dinners was now making decisions that affected thousands of employees, including the husband who had spent years dismissing her professional significance. David's initial reaction to my appointment had been a complex mixture of shock, hurt, and barely controlled anger. But as the days passed, his emotions evolved into something more complicated and harder to navigate. He began fluctuating between attempts to be supportive and moments of obvious resentment, creating an atmosphere in our home that felt like walking through a minefield where any conversation could trigger an explosion of accumulated frustrations. The first major test came during my second week as CEO, when I announced a comprehensive organizational assessment that would examine every department's effectiveness, efficiency, and alignment with the company's evolving strategic vision. The initiative was standard practice for new executive leadership, a necessary step in understanding the company's actual capabilities versus its reported performance. But for David, who worked in the sales department, it felt like his wife was subjecting his professional competence to scrutiny in ways that violated the privacy boundaries he expected between our personal and professional lives. "How can you be objective about evaluating my department when you're married to someone in it?" he asked one evening, as we attempted to have dinner together without discussing work matters. "Don't you see the conflict of interest inherent in this situation?" I set down my fork and looked at him across our dining room table, trying to find words that could bridge the gap between his discomfort and the reality of my responsibilities. "The assessment is being conducted by an independent consulting firm, using standardized methodologies. I'm not personally reviewing individual employee performance records or making decisions based on personal relationships." "But you'll see the results," David persisted. "You'll know how my performance compares to my colleagues, how my manager rates my contributions, whether I'm considered promotion material or dead weight. How is that supposed to make me feel?" The question revealed the deeper issue underlying David's struggle with our new circumstances. For 12 years, his professional identity had been independent from our marriage, an area where he could excel and receive recognition without any connection to his relationship with me. Now, suddenly, his career trajectory was subject to oversight from the woman he had consistently positioned as professionally inferior to himself. "David, your performance evaluations have always been subject to management review," I replied carefully. "The only thing that's changed is the identity of the person at the top of the organizational chart. Your direct supervisor is the same. Your responsibilities are the same, and your opportunities for advancement are based on the same criteria they've always been based on. Except now those criteria are being set by my wife," he said, his voice carrying a note of bitterness that made my heart ache. "The woman who used to ask me for advice about office politics is now the person who ultimately determines whether I get promoted or fired." The comment stung because it revealed how little David had understood about our previous conversations regarding workplace dynamics. When I had asked for his perspective on office politics, I hadn't been seeking guidance from a superior strategist. I had been trying to understand his point of view and create opportunities for meaningful dialogue about our respective professional experiences. But David had interpreted my curiosity as evidence of my dependence on his superior business acumen. "I never asked for your advice because I needed guidance," I said quietly. "I asked because I was interested in your perspective and wanted to understand how you thought about workplace challenges. There's a difference between seeking input and requiring direction." David fell silent, apparently processing the distinction I was drawing and perhaps beginning to recognize that many of our past conversations had been misinterpreted through the lens of his assumptions about our relative professional capabilities. But the silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken resentments and unexamined expectations that would require much more than a single conversation to resolve. The organizational assessment results, when they arrived 3 weeks later, revealed both the strengths and weaknesses I had anticipated based on my initial observations of Morrison Industries' culture and operations. The sales department, where David worked, was performing adequately but showed significant potential for improvement through better integration with marketing and customer service functions. David's individual performance ratings were solid, but unexceptional, placing him in the middle tier of his peer group without obvious prospects for rapid advancement. More concerning were the assessment findings about departmental silos, communication barriers, and leadership development gaps that were constraining the company's overall effectiveness. Morrison Industries had grown successful through individual competence and market positioning, but it lacked the collaborative culture and systematic talent development that would be necessary for continued growth in increasingly competitive markets. These findings validated the board's decision to bring in external leadership with expertise in organizational transformation, but they also meant that significant changes would be necessary across all departments, including areas where employees might prefer to maintain existing routines and relationships. The challenge would be implementing improvements while maintaining employee engagement and productivity during the transition period. I scheduled individual meetings with each department head to discuss the assessment findings and collaborate on improvement strategies. The conversations revealed a range of attitudes toward change, from enthusiastic embrace to barely concealed resistance. Most managers understood intellectually that evolution was necessary for long-term success, but many were apprehensive about disrupting systems and processes that had served them well in their current roles. Tom Williams, David's direct supervisor, in the sales department, exemplified this ambivalence during our meeting. "Dr. Mitchell, I appreciate the thorough analysis, and I agree that better integration with other departments could improve our results," he said, reviewing the assessment findings with careful attention. "But I'm concerned about how major changes might affect team morale and individual performance during the transition period." "What specific changes concern you most?" I asked, genuinely interested in understanding his perspective and identifying potential obstacles to successful implementation. "Well, the recommendation to restructure sales territories based on customer relationship mapping rather than geographic regions would require significant retraining and could disrupt established client relationships. And the proposal to implement collaborative performance metrics alongside individual sales targets might reduce the competitive drive that has made our team successful." Tom's concerns were legitimate and reflected the kind of thoughtful analysis I hope to see from all department heads, but I also sensed underlying anxiety about whether the changes would benefit or disadvantage specific team members, including David, whose performance might be evaluated differently under new systems and metrics. "Those are valid concerns that we'll need to address carefully through the implementation process," I replied. "Change management will be gradual, with extensive training and support to ensure that beneficial existing practices are preserved, while improvements are integrated systematically." "And what about employees who struggle to adapt to new approaches?" Tom asked. "Will there be negative consequences for people who need more time to adjust, or who discover that their skills are better suited to previous methods?" The question seemed to carry personal significance beyond general management concerns, and I suspected that Tom was thinking about specific team members whose continued success might be uncertain under modified performance criteria. David's name wasn't mentioned, but his presence hovered around the edges of our conversation like an unspoken complication that both Tom and I were trying to navigate diplomatically. "Our goal is to help every employee succeed within the evolving organizational structure," I said carefully. "We'll provide extensive training, mentoring, and support resources to ensure that capable people can adapt their skills to new requirements. Change is challenging, but it also creates opportunities for growth and development that might not exist under current systems." The meeting with Tom was representative of dozens of similar conversations I had with managers throughout Morrison Industries during my first month as CEO. Everyone understood that change was necessary, but everyone was also concerned about how those changes might affect their own positions, responsibilities, and advancement prospects. The personal stakes involved in organizational transformation created emotional undercurrents that required careful management alongside the technical aspects of implementing new systems and processes. But the most challenging conversations weren't happening in conference rooms with department heads. They were taking place across our dinner table at home, where David and I struggled to establish new patterns of communication that could accommodate the fundamental shift in our professional relationship. The easy intimacy we had shared about workplace experiences was now complicated by confidentiality requirements and potential conflicts of interest that neither of us had anticipated when we first fell in love. "I can't tell if you're being deliberately vague about work changes or if you're just protecting company confidentiality," David said one evening after I had deflected his questions about upcoming departmental restructuring plans. "It feels like you're treating me like any other employee rather than your husband." "I'm trying to balance transparency with appropriate professional boundaries," I replied, recognizing that this was a conversation we would probably have many times before finding a sustainable approach. There are things I can discuss with you, as my husband, that I can't share with you as an employee, and sometimes those distinctions aren't immediately obvious. So now I'm an employee first and your husband second? David's voice carried hurt that went beyond immediate frustration with communication logistics. When did that hierarchy get established? The question forced me to confront assumptions. I hadn't fully examined about how to navigate the competing demands of my personal and professional relationships. David was right that my natural instinct was to err on the side of maintaining professional confidentiality, partly because I was still learning the boundaries of my new role, but also because I was overcompensating for concerns about nepotism or favoritism that might undermine my credibility as a leader. "You're my husband first always," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "But I also have responsibilities to Morrison Industries that require maintaining certain confidentialities. I'm still learning how to balance those obligations, and I may be overcautious while I figure out the appropriate boundaries." David squeezed my hand but didn't seem entirely reassured by my explanation. It's just hard to suddenly feel like I'm on the outside of decisions that affect my daily work life. For years, we've shared everything about our jobs, and now there are whole areas that are off limits because of your position. His frustration was understandable and highlighted one of the unexpected challenges of our new circumstances. The professional intimacy we had shared, where we could discuss workplace challenges and strategic decisions without reservation, was now constrained by my fiduciary responsibilities to Morrison Industries and my need to maintain appropriate boundaries between personal relationships and business decisions. These domestic tensions were complicated by the reactions of our broader social circle, where friends and acquaintances were struggling to understand how David's wife had suddenly emerged as one of Seattle's most prominent business leaders. The couple, who had been introduced at parties as David the investment banker and his wife Sarah, who works in HR, was now forced to navigate social situations where I was often the more recognizable and professionally significant person in the room. The first major test of this new dynamic came at a charity fundraiser for the Seattle Children's Hospital, an annual event that attracted the city's business and social elite. David and I had attended this event for several years, where he had networked with potential clients and industry contacts, while I had participated in conversations about fundraising strategies and program effectiveness with other professional women whose careers were often overshadowed by their husbands' accomplishments. This year, however, I was introduced from the stage as one of the evening's major sponsors, recognition that came with my new position at Morrison Industries rather than any personal connection to the hospital's mission. The applause that followed was polite but substantial, acknowledging both my company's contribution and my individual prominence in the business community. David sat beside me during the introduction, his expression carefully composed but his discomfort evident in the tension around his eyes and the formal way he held his shoulders. When people approached our table during dinner to congratulate me on my appointment and discuss business matters, he found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the spouse who listened politely while others engaged with his wife about strategic decisions and industry trends. "Sarah, we've been following Morrison Industries' transformation initiatives in the Business Journal," said Rebecca Martinez, the CEO of a prominent marketing firm who had previously acknowledged David but largely ignored me at social events. "Your approach to integrating human capital development with business strategy is generating significant interest among other executives. Would you be available for a presentation at our next Industry Leadership Summit?" "I'd be honored to participate," I replied, genuinely pleased by the opportunity to share Morrison Industries' approach with other business leaders. Human-centered leadership is producing measurable results that I think other companies would find valuable to explore. As Rebecca and I discussed presentation topics and audience demographics, David remained silent beside me, occasionally nodding when someone included him in the conversation, but clearly struggling with his transformed role in these professional interactions. The man who had spent years positioning himself as the serious business professional while I played the supportive spouse was now experiencing the reverse dynamic in ways that challenged his fundamental assumptions about our relationship. Hierarchy. Later that evening, as we drove home from the fundraiser, David was unusually quiet until we were nearly back to our neighborhood. "That was an interesting evening," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral but laden with implications. "The hospital raised more money than they had projected," I replied, deliberately focusing on the charitable mission rather than the social dynamics that I knew were troubling him. Dr. Anderson seemed optimistic about expanding their pediatric research programs. "I wasn't talking about the fundraising," David said. "I was talking about watching my wife become the center of attention at an event where I used to be the one making business connections." The comment hung between us as we pulled into our driveway, representing months of accumulated tension about our shifted roles and uncertain future together. David's identity had been built around professional achievement and social recognition, and my sudden prominence was forcing him to confront aspects of himself and our relationship that he had never questioned before. "David, your professional accomplishments haven't disappeared because I accepted a new position," I said gently. "You're still successful at what you do, still respected by your colleagues, still building your career according to your own goals and timeline." "But everything feels different now," he replied. "People look at me differently, treat me differently. I used to be David Mitchell, senior investment advisor with Morrison Industries. Now I'm Sarah Mitchell's husband. The whole context has changed." His observation was accurate, and I understood why the change felt threatening to someone whose identity was so closely tied to professional status and social positioning. But I also recognized that David's discomfort reflected assumptions about relationship hierarchies that neither of us had questioned during our marriage, assumptions that were now being challenged by circumstances neither of us had anticipated. "Maybe the context needed to change," I said carefully. "Maybe we both needed to discover that our relationship could survive and even thrive without traditional power dynamics that positioned one of us as professionally superior to the other." David was quiet for a moment, apparently considering the implications of what I was suggesting. When he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that reminded me of the man I had fallen in love with 12 years earlier. "I'm not sure I know how to be married to someone more successful than I am," he admitted. "I never learned those skills, never imagined I would need them. Everything I thought I understood about being a husband was based on assumptions that no longer apply." The honesty in his admission touched something deep in my heart, reminding me that David's struggle with our new circumstances wasn't primarily about ego or resentment, but about genuine confusion regarding how to navigate uncharted territory in our relationship. He was confronting fundamental questions about identity, worth, and partnership that were challenging him to grow in ways he had never expected. "We'll figure it out together," I told him, taking his hand as we sat in our darkened car. "Neither of us has a roadmap for this situation, but we have 12 years of love and commitment to build on. That has to be enough foundation for whatever comes next." But even as I spoke those words, I was uncertain whether our marriage could survive the dramatic transformation in our circumstances. The patterns and assumptions that had governed our relationship for over a decade were proving difficult to dismantle, and new patterns that could accommodate our changed reality were not immediately obvious or easy to establish. The challenge became more complex during my second month as CEO, when Morrison Industries announced a major expansion into international markets that would require significant organizational restructuring and personnel changes. The initiative represented exactly the kind of strategic growth opportunity that justified the board's decision to bring in transformational leadership. But it also meant that some employees would face reassignment, additional training requirements, or modified job responsibilities. David's department was directly affected by the expansion plans, which called for restructuring sales territories to align with international market opportunities rather than traditional domestic regions. The changes would create advancement, possibilities for some team members, while potentially marginalizing others whose skills were better suited to established client relationships rather than new market development. As Tom Williams briefed his team about the upcoming changes, David found himself confronting uncertainty about his own career trajectory in ways that were directly connected to strategic decisions being made by his wife. The professional autonomy he had enjoyed throughout his career was now subject to oversight from someone whose personal opinions about his capabilities were inevitably influenced by their intimate relationship. The international expansion is a tremendous opportunity for Morrison Industries, Tom explained during the department meeting that David described to me later that evening. But it will require some of us to develop new skills and adapt to different client management approaches than we've used in domestic markets. What kind of timeline are we looking at for these changes? Asked Jennifer Walsh, one of David's colleagues who had been with the company for nearly a decade. Implementation will begin next quarter, with full transition expected within 18 months. Training programs are being developed to help everyone adapt to new requirements, and there will be opportunities for specialization in either domestic or international client management. David had listened to this presentation with growing anxiety about how the changes might affect his own position within the department. His strengths lay in relationship management with established clients, skills that had served him well in traditional sales approaches, but might be less relevant in international market development that required different cultural competencies and strategic thinking. How will performance be evaluated during the transition period? David had asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite his personal concerns about the answer. That's still being finalized by senior leadership, Tom replied, a response that reminded everyone in the room that ultimate authority for these decisions rested with someone whose personal relationship with David created unprecedented complications for objective performance assessment. When David shared this conversation with me, I could see the stress and uncertainty that were becoming constant companions in his daily work experience. The changes at Morrison Industries were necessary for long-term competitive success, but they were also forcing David to confront questions about his adaptability and career prospects that felt more personal than professional because of our marriage. I don't know how to prepare for performance evaluations when I don't understand the criteria that will be used, he told me that night, as we attempted to have dinner without discussing work matters. And I can't ask my manager for clarification, without it seeming like I'm trying to use my personal relationship with the CEO for inside information. The situation David described was exactly the kind of conflict of interest I had been trying to avoid, but it was also an inevitable consequence of implementing necessary organizational changes while being married to someone who would be affected by those changes. There was no perfect solution that could completely separate my professional responsibilities from the impact those decisions would have on David's career and our personal relationship. The performance criteria for all sales positions are being standardized based on measurable outcomes and competency assessments, I said carefully. Your success will depend on the same factors that determine success for all your colleagues, with no special consideration based on our personal relationship. But that's exactly what I'm afraid of, David replied, his frustration finally boiling over. I don't want special consideration, but I also don't want to be held to higher standards because you need to prove you're not showing favoritism. Either way, our marriage becomes a factor in my professional evaluation. David's concern was legitimate and highlighted the impossible position he found himself in as my husband and my employee. Any positive outcome could be attributed to favoritism, while any negative outcome might be seen as overcompensation for our relationship. His professional achievements would now be filtered through assumptions about nepotism or reverse discrimination that had nothing to do with his actual capabilities or performance. The situation reached a crisis point during my third month as CEO, when Tom Williams requested a private meeting to discuss David's performance and potential fit with the evolving requirements of the sales department. The conversation I had been dreading since accepting the CEO position was finally unavoidable. forcing me to navigate the intersection of my professional responsibilities and personal relationships in ways that would have lasting consequences for both. Dr. Mitchell, I need to discuss some concerns about David's adaptation to our new sales methodologies, Tom began, his discomfort with the subject evident in his formal tone and careful word choices. He's a capable relationship manager with established clients, but he's struggling with the strategic thinking and cultural competency requirements for international market development. My heart sank as Tom outlined specific examples of David's challenges with new training programs and his resistance to collaborative approaches that emphasized team-based problem-solving rather than individual achievement. The feedback painted a picture of someone whose skills were becoming less relevant to Morrison Industries' evolving needs, regardless of any personal relationship to executive leadership. What kind of support has been provided to help him develop these new competencies? I asked, trying to maintain professional objectivity while fighting internal anxiety about the implications for David's career and our marriage. He's participated in all required training programs and has been paired with a mentor who specializes in international client development, Tom replied. But his performance metrics suggest that he's not successfully integrating new approaches with his existing skills. His client satisfaction scores remain strong, but his ability to identify and develop new market opportunities is below department standards. The assessment Tom provided was fair, objective, and based on measurable performance indicators that had nothing to do with favoritism or discrimination. David was struggling with organizational changes that challenged many employees, but his particular difficulties were becoming obstacles to his continued success within the evolving sales department structure. What options are available for employees who need additional development time or might be better suited to modified responsibilities? I asked, exploring alternatives that could preserve David's employment while acknowledging his performance challenges. We could consider reassignment to domestic client management, which would maintain his current compensation but limit his advancement opportunities within the international expansion strategy. Or we could extend his development timeline with additional training and mentoring, though that would require significant resource investment without guaranteed results. Tom's presentation of options was professional and appropriate, but it also made clear that David's career trajectory at Morrison Industries was now constrained by capabilities that he might or might not be able to develop successfully. The husband, who had expected promotion and advancement, was instead facing potential reassignment or extended probationary status under the leadership of his wife. I'll need to review his complete performance file before making any decisions, I said, recognizing that this was the moment when my professional responsibilities would directly conflict with my personal desire to protect David from consequences that would damage both his career and our marriage. Of course, Tom replied. I'll have HR prepare a comprehensive assessment for your review. I want to emphasize that this isn't about personal considerations. It's purely about alignment between individual capabilities and evolving organizational requirements. As Tom left my office, I sat alone contemplating the impossible situation that had developed around David's performance challenges. As CEO, I had a responsibility to make decisions based on organizational needs and employee capabilities, without regard to personal relationships. As David's wife, I wanted to find ways to protect him from career setbacks that would devastate his confidence and potentially destroy our marriage. But I was also beginning to understand that the crisis surrounding David's performance was revealing fundamental issues that went beyond immediate workplace challenges. His resistance to collaborative approaches and strategic thinking requirements reflected deeper attitudes about professional relationships and business methodology that had shaped our marriage dynamic for over a decade. The man who had dismissed my expertise in organizational psychology was now struggling with exactly the kind of challenges that my research and consulting experience had prepared me to address. The husband who had positioned relationship management As superior to strategic thinking was discovering that evolving markets required integrated competencies that he had never developed. The partner who had assumed that traditional business approaches would always be sufficient was confronting the reality that success required continuous learning and adaptation. That evening, as I prepared to leave Morrison Industries, I carried with me the weight of decisions that would affect not only David's career, but the future of our marriage. The woman who had been invisible at corporate dinners was now responsible for determining whether her husband could adapt to organizational changes or would need to find new directions for his professional development. The confrontation I had been avoiding since accepting the CEO position was finally unavoidable. David and I would need to have honest conversations about his performance challenges, our relationship dynamics, and the fundamental assumptions that had governed our marriage for 12 years. The outcome of those conversations would determine whether we could build a new foundation for partnership or whether the revelation of our respective capabilities would ultimately drive us apart. Standing in my executive office as the Seattle skyline darkened outside my windows, I realized that the most difficult decisions of my tenure as CEO would not involve strategic planning or organizational development. They would involve navigating the collision between professional responsibilities and personal relationships, between objective assessment and emotional loyalty, between the leader I needed to be and the wife I had always been. The journey ahead would test not only my executive capabilities, but also my capacity for integrating competing demands in ways that preserved both organizational integrity and personal authenticity. The woman who had spent years helping other companies navigate complex transformations was about to discover whether she could successfully manage the most challenging change of all, the evolution of her own marriage under circumstances that neither she nor David could have anticipated when they first promised to support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.